Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, idiot, and loin streamer, and today we're going to be following up sort of with a video discussion that kind of goes with what was discussed on Thursday, but not totally. It is kind of more like a perpendicular discussion as opposed to like on the same plane. And it has to do with should this book be published? The ethics testing a memoir to decide whether to publish it or not. And this is actually going to go into other things like the question of intent versus impact, which is something that comes up very often in the politically correct book community, I think. And it's very interesting in how it feels like that is just something that exists to be weaponized because only certain types of people will use it, and it will only be used against certain types of books. Man, I'm just thinking about how Gretchen is. Okay, when you talk about Gretchen Felker Martin's books, and it's brought up that they are very aggressive, very toxic. And you can go to Gretchen's social media and see people have responded saying stuff like those books are transphobic, and Gretchen saying, I don't care if other people say that they're transphobic. I don't think they're transphobic. Okay, so then what about other situations in other books where people say, well, that was not the intent? Intent doesn't matter. It's the impact. Okay, what if the impact of seeing Gretchen's book is that people think less because the stuff is so disgusting and so fetishistic, but it doesn't come up? Anyway, we'll get into impact versus intent and also authorial intent. You can probably guess where I stand on it. Maybe you can't. Maybe nobody really knows what I think anymore because I'm a wild card. But before we get started, number one, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Number two, if you would like to be featured on the channel, check out the links down in the description below. The number one way to be featured is through Lemoy, the monthly prompt writing contest, where I give you a prompt, you write a short story using the prompt, and on the first Monday video of the month, we bask in your creative genius. The second way to be featured is if you are an indie author and you have a book out or a book that is coming out. If you submit it through the Fresh Meat feature, the first chapter will be read here to hopefully help more readers find your work. Maybe it's me. Likely it is not me, but it could very well be me. I've grabbed a couple books off of that. I still have a couple books to read off of that. I have bought second books that were by the authors that they didn't submit to that, but I bought more from them. And so that happens. The third thing is if you would like to check out any of my books and determine whether I should be canceled for unethics. They're available at any of your favorite places. Two good books, including your local library upon request. My newest novel, Bodymore Zero, featuring these gentlemen over here, set of brothers, is available at the end of this month. I am so excited for it. It is the project I am most proud of to date, which, you know, at least tells me that I think that I am honing my craft. I think I'm getting better at storytelling. I definitely think it is way better than Bodymore 1, which I think Bodymore 1 is good, but I can understand some of the weaknesses of Bodymore 1 and what I could have done better in some of those cases. But with that said, let's jump into the articles to talk about morality, ethics, and publishing. This is from Psychology Today. Emily T. Troskano Cianco. There we go. In the first part of this series, I described how I ended up accidentally writing an anorexia recovery memoir. Once it was finalized, I realized that despite all of my efforts to make it something that would be helpful, not harmful to readers, I had no idea whether I'd succeeded. The realization came when I was out gardening. I was peer reviewing a journal article about representation of eating disorders in recent French literature, and the article included a line about the disingenuousness of authors who publish books about their own eating disorder experience, despite saying that reading about other people's eating disorders had only ever been unhelpful for them. I didn't want to be one of those disingenuous authors, and I definitely didn't want to publish something that made recovery harder rather than easier for anyone. The sentence that really woke me up in that article I was reviewing included a citation of my own previous research. Quote, however, in the light of Trosienko's study, such claims may appear misguided or even disingenuous. In some cases, authors claim that their goal is to help or inspire others and include a detail of how their own reading of ED memoirs and novels fueled their disordered eating. Seeing my own work enlisted to get this point across made the message hit home even harder. I must not ignore the implications of my own research. Not long after I'd come in from weeding, it had become pretty rapidly clear that an experiment was needed. The research referenced in that article was a survey study asking people about their experiences of reading narratives about eating disorders and their preferred other genres. What was needed was something experimental, not observational, something with a control group and randomization that lets you come to a conclusion about causality. And in this experiment, to supplement the efforts and hopes with evidence, there would need to be stakes. Specifically, it would need to be completely clear whether the book had passed or failed the test, whatever I decided the test should be. Okay. So one of the first things that should become clear from this, which is pretty bad since it's from some place called Psychology Today, so what we're talking about psychology, is this assumption that everybody is going to respond to the same exact stories the same exact ways. Not that some people might find it helpful while other people might not find it helpful. There are some people to keep it on the eating disorder train, but to not change it too much, is there are big accounts on YouTube that do feeding content or they do mukbangs. And some people use the mukbangs for personal encouragement or for reminders on their own weight loss journeys, on what they don't want to become, while other people use those mukbangs for sexual purposes because they are feeders of sorts, or because they like seeing, feeders is going to get into the other things, because they are feeders, or because they are attracted to BBWs or BBMs. I don't know if BBMs is a legitimate thing, but it is now. It's a term now. So people can respond to the same thing differently. If you look at any book, you'll see some people say this is an excellent representation and an excellent show of this mental illness, while others will say this is a terrible version of this mental illness or this disorder. Some people will say, hey, I am of this background and this is very much like my background, while others will be like, what the frick is this? It is nothing like my background. There is no way to 100% write something that everybody is going to respond to. And is this making me think of like classrooms where they assume that most kids need to and will learn the exact same way, and there is something wrong with you if you don't learn the exact same way? And so here it's assuming that everybody interacting with something will respond the same way. And so then she needs to make sure that she is ethically producing the right thing. Goes into like, what inspires the idea of sensitivity readers to make sure that the representation in the book is accurate? Now, all that you can do is try to make something as believable as possible, but there is no way to create a character who is a monolith that represents and matches the perspective, the experiences of everybody with that same identity marker, even if you go to the smallest minority available that is not an individual. If you tried to write a story where the main character was specifically identified as an individual, you're still not going to be able to represent the individual because there are billions of individuals. That's the point. Anyway. This was not a conventional experiment. I know of no other that has ever aimed to determine a publish or don't publish decision for a work of memoir or fiction. With no close precedents to draw on, it took me a long time to work out the design, including what exactly to measure, what the control conditions should be to compare against reading the book, and who the participants should be. For some of the methodological questions that needed resolving, see my discussion here. Then it took a while to get ethics clearance and a lot longer to recruit enough participants and analyze the data and write the paper through a peer review process and publish. 4 years in total from that COVID summer afternoon pulling up brambles. Part of the ethics approval process included demonstrating we had structures in place to guard against experimenter bias, since this was me leading a study on my own book. Once it was done and I was writing up the results for publication, I had a disagreeable conversation with a senior medical humanities professor whose response to my one-line description of the experiment was, well, you're the last person in the world who should be doing that project, aren't you? Her point was that the author of the book should not be the lead experimenter, but I think that she was wrong, as well as profoundly uncurious. I made sure that the design was robust, of course, and employed a colleague to take care of participant recruitment and day-to-day management of the study, while another colleague did the quantitative data analysis. All this helped run the experiment, and the results made sense as rigorously and seamlessly as possible. But ultimately, it didn't seem like there was a serious risk of bias since pass or fail for the book were both win for me. As with well-designed experiments, the great thing about this one is that we have to learn something, or we will learn something useful, whatever the outcome. And more pointedly, in either case, I would get to avoid the scenario where I publish something and it's horribly triggering or otherwise damaging for people. Of course, no experimental results can provide guarantees for any individual in the future, but at least performing this one would give me a confident sense of whether the book was likely to do harm or good or neither. In the final part of the series, I'll cover the findings on the broader implications of that. So that's to tell you that one, this article is blue balling us. But number two, this is the idea that no matter what you do, it is going to possibly hurt somebody, but there's no way to check for that. So if somebody reads your story and they end up having an emotional response to it, that is just like it's reminding them of a trauma in their past life, that's something that generally they need to go and seek therapy for, because if you're responding to a book like that and it is something that you lose control over, that is an emotional need that you should not really be having set off in a book. If you can't just put it down, it's okay to have an emotional response to a book. It's okay to be moved or the like, but to have a traumatic meltdown usually speaks to a much deeper issue that if you run into it in real life, you're going to run into a bad problem. A book you can close. A book is not real. I've had stuff in general that I start getting physically ill, and so I have to put the book down. But there's no way to tell if something is going to do harm or do good to an individual. There is no by and large. And what this actually does is it tries to go back to from Thursday's video where it says, do we all think the same? It tries to sanitize content to assume that it has to be a certain way or else it is going to be bad. Is you cannot affect somebody. Is you cannot represent an experience if you think that somebody else will have a poor reception to that experience. But what if it is your real experience? Especially since this is about a nonfiction thing, if talking about your experience triggers somebody else's experience, when the book talks about specifically being about anorexia, that means somebody going into it knows what they're going into. If it doesn't help them, okay. If they get triggered in a negative way, that might be something to take to a therapist to help them deal with on a different basis. Because if a book takes you there, you probably need other help, or you can avoid those triggers entirely, because sometimes that is the way that you have to go. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I really don't understand the idea of how you can think that you can publish something that will be completely benign to everybody, but it still have meaning. Let me know what your thoughts are on that, because this is going back to the idea of impact versus intent. So if somebody writes something with the intent to have a positive impact and it doesn't turn out that way, do you hold them accountable? Because it wasn't even said or done to have a bad outcome. It was said to have a good outcome. If somebody says, hey, Cupcake, and it was meant to be a pet name to make somebody feel special, but that person breaks down because it makes them think that they're fat. It has an emotional, their parent who beat them used to call them Cupcake. If you didn't mean to do that, are you a bad person for having done that? Because it wasn't your intent. Or, oh, this has come up before. This is a better example, is I've seen conversations with the Twitter getting into things, talking about people getting into fights from not understanding each other, like taking something in an insulting way that was not meant to be an insult, but they got insulted, so they insulted the person back, so that person insulted them back. Now, if somebody is not meaning to be insulting, isn't it okay to say, hey, look, I don't think that you're trying to be insulting. I understand where you're coming from, and thank you for the compliment, even if it's not the best worded. Like, does impact matter more than intent? If the person is not trying to hurt you, if the person is not trying to insult you, then it should be accepted that what they're trying to do is goodwill. Another example, to give it exact words, if somebody says Merry Christmas, and you're not a Christian, you don't really do Christmas, they're wishing you Merry Christmas is a tidings of goodwill, is a greetings of goodwill, is them hoping you a happy holidays, them hoping that you have a good time with your family. To get mad at somebody for saying Merry Christmas because you don't believe in Christmas or you're not a Christian, so it's an insult, is then saying the impact is worse than the intent. And it always sets somebody up for you being the victim if you feel like being the victim. Nobody can ever perform to read your mind and not hurt you. So if you end up in this situation where you go, well, will my book cause harm or cause good? You're going to end up never publishing anything because you can never anticipate the response that your book will get. Another example for the book specific situation would be Stephen King's Rage. And how many people read Stephen King's Rage and did not do anything? Meanwhile, there were like 2 or 3 cases in a span of a couple of years where Rage was found in the locker of school shooters or would-be school shooters. And so Stephen King asked for the book to be pulled because he felt like the impact of the book, well, he said that he felt the impact of the book was contributing to this. How many more did this not happen to? And so then you're still going to say that the impact, which is a couple of this, is greater than the intent, which was what? To show empathy, to show understanding of a perspective. So all that you can really do if you look at this impact versus intent and you lean on the, well, if it does harm to anybody, then it must be censored, is you are going to say the human experience, period, is too dangerous to share honestly. So we must sanitize all human experience. I don't understand how you can actually hold this perspective and do anything or view anything. Because it shows me that you think that all people are virtually the same. And maybe you do. Maybe, I don't put it past people. I know that there is a subcategory of people that believe in this blank slate theory or this blank slate idea where everybody is replaceable. Everybody can be programmed to believe the same. There is no deviation in human biology or genetics or disposition that may impact things or culture that may impact things. Talk to a couple of siblings and see how different they are despite having the same parents, and you're like, probably not. Anyway, the benefits of writing versus the ethics of publishing. Additionally, Emily wrote the benefits of writing versus ethics of publishing. In part 1 and part 2 of this post, I described how I found myself inadvertently writing a recovery memoir, a type of book that my own research had shown is often harmful to people with eating disorders, and how I realized once I had a full draft that it was ethically important to find out how readers would respond to it before deciding whether or not to publish it. The experimental design involved clear don't publish criteria if there was a worsening in the participation score on the main clinical severity measure that we used, and if that worsening was greater in the group reading of the memoir than the group reading the control text, and if the effective size of the difference was large by a statistical definition, there was no expectation that the book should be good, only that it should not do demonstrable harm. The book passed the test. It did not do harm beyond the threshold that we decided was acceptable. Indeed, reading it turned out to do significant good on the both measures that we used. Increasingly, this also proved true for the book read by the control group, 10 Zen Questions by fellow Psychology Today contributor and my mother, Sue Blackmore, the first-person book about Zen meditation. The paper reported on our rationale, methods, and results was recently published in the Journal of Eating Disorders entitled Ethics Testing on Eating Disordered Memoirs, a pre-publication experiment. The unexpected main findings raise all kinds of new questions about what factors were actually doing the good, something shared by the 2 books, or something about the structured reading setup, with questions being asked at intervals. As ever, one experiment opens the door to more. For now, though, it's satisfying to have taken this fundamentally question-asking book. The first line is, so what was it like heading off to university at 18 with it all clear from a child psychiatrist, and asked some difficult and important questions of it, specifically to have asked and also answered a very simple one. Should this book be published? I've grown very interested in why this simple question doesn't apparently get asked more often, why it's so often assumed that the answer is, should I write this book, is the same answer as, should I publish it? I've been observing with interest where counterexamples have popped up that show a pause for question asking being inserted between writing and publishing. A little A very literal example of taking a pause comes from recovery coach Tabitha Farrar. Having kindly agreed to help with the recruitment of the study, she created a YouTube video in which she mentioned having written a book about her own experiences of anorexia. She had doubts about publishing it even while she was writing, and then she set the complete draft aside for 6 months before rereading it. When she did so, her immediate verdict on the book was, would this trigger the shit out of everyone that reads it? So she decided that she would not publish it, and that she never will. Also focused on eating disorders, June Alexander offers memoir mentoring that frames memoir writing as a method of self-healing. She stresses the value of writing about one's own illness and recovery experience, but equally the importance of asking careful questions about what to do with the resulting text. Beyond the eating disorder world, the well-known memoirist Tucker Max runs a high-ticket memoir writing course that separates writing from publishing. It's clear in his publicity material that the writing is an important part, and that for many individuals, getting a couple of copies printed for their family is as far as publication really needs to go. Of course, asking the question, should I publish this, is only the first step. What options arise once we have asked the question and it isn't immediately clear to us what the answer is, yes or no, publish or don't. So I think that this is an important thing to ask specifically with memoir, because there are texts and there are writing exercises and there's writing in general journaling that is very personal, that is dealing with trauma, that is working through your thoughts or things that happen to you. And I don't necessarily think publishing something that personal, if you're still working through it or it still feels raw and personal, is a good thing. Because when you publish something, it now becomes a product. And so if you still feel so closely related, like that book is literally you, because it is literally you, it is your emotions on the page as a therapy. If you think that it is going to cause you mental harm when you receive feedback on your book, you shouldn't publish it. I've seen some people talk about how their fiction novels are expressions of really themselves and what they've been through. I know The Small Backs of Children by Lydia Yakunovic is specifically from her. I know Shards by Bret Easton Ellis. He said that that is part autobiography, and you have to be able to separate yourself from your work. So if it receives a critical feedback, if it says something about the character that is technically you, you don't have a meltdown. Because it's going to happen. There is no book that pleases everybody. And so you are going to receive, if your book is read by a variety of people, you are going to receive critical feedback. And if you cannot handle it, do not publish it. Just because you've gotten the words down doesn't mean that you should publish it. Same with first drafts. I know a lot of you. I've seen you. I don't know if you're watching this video, but I've seen you rushing out content as fast as you can and then publishing a first draft and then being surprised when you get not great reviews. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. One example of how to work out an answer that doesn't need the time, money, or research expertise required to conduct a randomized controlled experiment comes from Meaningful 23 Life-Changing Stories of Conquering Dieting, Weight, and Body Image Issues, a volume published by another Psychology Today contributor, Alia Spots DeLaser. In the design and writing phase, she had already taken some important steps to skew the likely answer to the should I go ahead and publish question towards yes. She had paid careful attention to the ratios of suffering and healing, to the range of feature narratives, and to the amount of detail given when disordered behaviors were being described. She had also incorporated a range of tactics that, rather like the dialogue form used in A Very Hungry Anorexic, as I described in part 1, created a varied tapestry of perspectives that seemed likely to guard against unhelpful immersion into the unhealthy mindset. For instance, each contributor's story is followed by a short note from Spots DeLaser that adds context, teases out themes, and poses thought-provoking questions, and each contributor also gives some space to tease out generalizable lessons from their own experiences. Especially in areas where comparison, ambivalence, and harmful glamorization are widespread, including many forms of illness and addiction, I hope that publishers and agents might also start to get more interested in asking, at the relevant stages of the book's conception, creation, and publication, stark yes or no questions like, should this be published? As well as exploratory open questions like, what would make this as useful as possible for readers? What would make it harmful for readers? And what benefits have you experienced from writing this? And how do they relate to those of you who hope and intend for the readers? So I think that there are some books that I'm like, you probably should have asked yourself if you should have if you should have put that out there. But one of the things with our current media landscape and the freedom that we have with self-publishing, especially, is that anything can be published. And many don't really necessarily think about what they're doing or what the purpose of their story is, or stories are written for the purpose of destruction. Like, this also assumes that everybody publishing is publishing for the same reason, which is to help. But there are destructive writers out there. Just like if you look at the history of visual mediums, there were artists that wanted to create things. I'm not going to call it artwork because it was specifically designed to devaluate and destroy the standards of art. Like, that was the purpose. And so not everybody is approaching with this perspective. I do think it is helpful for every creator of any kind, especially writers, since you're kind of an army of one usually, to look at what you're writing and to go, is this ready? Should I publish it? What is the impact that you are trying to go for? Or what is the intent behind what you are doing? And does this accomplish that? And there are many that will publish things that are political or that are specifically personal that, you know, I might be like, did that need to be published? But other people would say, yes, it does need to be published because it's something that speaks to them. And how do we get around it? There really is no way to get around it. But I think the bigger thing when it comes to should this be published has more to do with the readers of the content and the author of the content being respectful of potential readers to not specifically try and trick them. Now, this is separate from putting trigger warnings. If you want to put trigger warnings or content warnings, like, nobody should be forced to do it, but nobody should really be harassed if they choose to do it themselves because it's a personal decision. In the same way, if I choose to write a story this way versus that way, it's on me. It's my choice. But when you're making book recommendations or you're doing a book reviews, you should be cognizant of the type of book that you are recommending. And if you know the person that you're recommending, or if it's content that you don't think is usually in the alley of that person, or it might be very different than what they're going to do, you should warn people of what is in the book so they're not blindsided by it, especially extreme content. One of the issues that I've had with this in the past, specifically that I've talked about on this channel, is Kay Webster with The Wild, where there was a note at the end of Kay Webster saying to specifically hide the pedophilic and incestual nature of the book because, quote, somebody might miss out on their next favorite romance. Now, if you want to read that, fine. If you got friends who want to read that, fine. I think trying to trick people into reading that is disgusting. If I were to talk about The Story of the Eye, I would never actually recommend anybody read The Story of the Eye because I didn't like it. I think it was disgusting. If you want to read it, go ahead. But if somebody asked for recommendations of disturbing or historical books, I may give them some recommendations, but I'm going to warn them of the content of the book so they do not get surprised. One of them would be, I'm not going to tell you to go and read 120 Days of Sodom without telling you that there is like the first 100 and like what 250 pages is almost all coprophilia mixed in with sex, like pedophilic sexual stuff with minors, because they've got 16 kids. It's torture, it's rape, and there's a lot of shit. There's so much. And I know that I've got blind spots when it comes to certain things that I'm like, I don't necessarily think that that is extreme. But I will try to remember other people's lines. And if there is something in there for those lines, I'm usually not going to recommend them things that break those lines. Like if somebody is, I don't like things that kill animals or kill dogs specifically. I don't like things that hurt children. I don't like things that destroy buildings. I don't like things that have cheating spouses in them that are glorified. That's, I think, where the responsibility is at more so than should I publish this? Because you're never going to be able to stop the publication of anything at this point in time. Such processes would be related to the increasingly common sensitivity read, which is intended to improve the accuracy of portrayals of specific types of characters or experiences. But again, as I've talked about before with sensitivity readers, that makes a monolith of any experience where you can't actually do that. Because while this person might say that's accurate, this other person is going to say that's not accurate. And the character in the book is not you. What do you do if the character in the book represents the writer and then somebody else goes, look, I also had that experience, but mine was way different? Like somebody might write a book about their parents being divorced and they got 2 Christmases and their life was made way better by them having 2 sets of parents. But I can't read that and go, well, that's inaccurate because that was not my life experience. Well, of course it wasn't my life experience. They're not writing my life. So what do you do if you have sensitivity reads that are, well, I need to make sure that I accurately portray this experience? How do you do that without making it a monolith experience and then saying, well, everybody else's experiences that fall outside of that are not legitimate? Reflective prompts for authors and feedback gathering with prospective readers are 2 examples of how authors and those who work with them could explore the ethics of what they're doing and why, including by being willing to ask the simple yes or no, and if needed, to choose no. Oh, another area on this would be, I think it matters what your intent is for your book specifically, because if you're writing, I want to write this book specifically to change people or specifically to lecture people or specifically to teach people, then you're going to have different needs than if you're writing a fiction book and you're just trying to write whatever. If you're trying to feed tropes, then you're not going to need the same accuracy as other things. And if you are not secure in your rendition of something, if you don't feel like you are accurately portraying your character because you don't really understand that mindset, sensitivity readers, I think, is something for you to choose for yourself, the same way as trigger warnings are, but nobody should be forced into it. Nobody should be guilted into it. And it should be used only if you personally do not feel secure in the rendition of what it is that you are trying to do. Personally, I research. I'll ask questions if I need to know more about things. And there are people that I know that are willing to answer those questions. I will look at documentaries. I will look at eyewitness statements. I will look at memoirs. I will look at all sorts of things to kind of gather an idea. But ultimately, the way that I write comes down to understanding the mindset of the characters and understanding how the characters make decisions in the circumstances that they live in. All of my writing comes down to the Meisner method of acting, which is living honestly under imaginary circumstances. So everything is, as far as I can consider it, when I'm in the perspective of the characters, I'm thinking of what are the limitations and the choices and the things that have affected this character. And I do that for every character in the scene. Who are they? Where are they coming from? Why are they thinking like this? Why are they acting like this? And I can usually answer the reasons behind why people are acting the way that they are. In the meantime, I'll be keeping an eye out for other examples of how writers address this ethical question for themselves in collaboration with prospective readers or otherwise. If you know of any individuals who have done or are doing the same thing, please do get in touch. So that's, I guess, the point in this video where I say, as an author, where do you land on intent versus impact? And where do you land on when you're looking at a book and saying, should this be published? Should I be published? Should I publish this? And if you are not a reader or as a reader, you can also answer this if you're a writer as well as a reader. Have you ever come across any books that you thought, why was this published? Should this have been published? So I'm going to give an example of a book that I've actually talked about on this channel this year, and that would be Tampa by Alyssa Nutting. And that is a book about a middle school teacher who preys on 14-year-olds, inspired by a real case that was in the city of Tampa, which is where it got its name. It's also why Celeste has a husband, even though he's completely irrelevant to the story. Anyway, the title of that video is How Did This Get Published? So that question more so goes to the extremeness of the content and how other stories that are less extreme have been turned down for being and called too extreme, or have been called, we, the publisher, do not feel comfortable publishing this because of the ideologies in it, but that is fine. And so then you start purity testing. Well, we only publish stuff that we politically agree with. You don't want to set that standard for yourself. Let me just say, it's it's a losing battle because you're never going to 100% agree with your authors that you represent. But I asked in that video, how is this published? Because I thought that it was poorly written. Now, other people in a comment, you can go through that comment section, and there are a good number of people that thought that it was well written, that liked it for the same reasons that I hated it, which is how you go, this is there. You cannot do this. If you want to talk about impact versus intent, the author's stated intent was to bring attention to the double standard of female sexual predators being given lesser consequences or no consequences, especially if they're hot, while males are not really acknowledged. Like, that also just uses the young boys as tools and dismisses them. And there's no male accusations in the book. I give reasons or expressions. I give critique in that book of how it could have been done better to show the contradictions, such as having a male teacher who had a student coming on to him and he was trying to push her away, but then gets accused of rape anyway, and that guy goes to jail while Celeste gets off. Like, that would show the contradiction in that nature. Something else I've seen since publishing that video, and this has happened in conversation, so let me know what you guys think. I'm just sharing what I've seen. One part of that is when Celeste is in court and being tried for it. There are people picketing outside, but the men aren't there. It's women outside saying she needs to pay, but the men aren't there. And then the male lawyer is up there saying, hey, isn't she hot? Wouldn't you be happy if she was your teacher and she molested you? Now, something that doesn't come up in these books or in these discussions is how male sexual assault is often either dismissed by men a lot, or male victims are humiliated and emasculated for not wanting the sex. And so how do you discuss this topic of male victims in society if anytime you bring it up, you get men saying, wow, they're lucky? And I'm not saying every man does this, but I've mentioned this at work with my 73-year-old before, because he always wants to know what books I'm reading. He enjoys hearing it just as much as you guys do, because I read some wild stuff. And I mentioned the sexual abuse of boys like this. And he, every time, without pause, without hesitation, says, man, I wish I was that lucky. And you see it in articles too. And again, I'm not making claims about everyone, but I wanted to present this as a thought. When you have a male criminal, like the Joker murderer guy here in Florida that got popular on TikTok because he looks like a dark romance bad boy, you have people thirsting over him. Generally speaking, the response is, I can fix him. They think that he's just got a sad, broken heart. They want to fix him. They don't want him to hurt anymore. But when you have the opposite, where it is a female attacker and a male victim, especially a young male victim, it's usually, I wish I was the victim. So that is a mindset that I have at least seen. And I wanted to bring it up because I haven't really seen it talked about, and it's probably been talked about somewhere, but I want to get your guys' thoughts on it, which is this difference in the fantasy of, I wish I was the victim, as opposed to, I can fix the broken heart. I can be the one to mend that bad boy. How do you navigate when you bring up a crime and you always have the same response from certain groups of people, which is just dismissive? Like, there's nothing that you can do, right? Going back to talking about Marcella. If Marcella says, I would like to marry the person that I love, if everybody goes, you're just silly, there's nothing that you can do with that. They're not taking it seriously. I wish I was getting married to some mogul and going to be rich for the rest of my life. You're so lucky. There's nothing that you can do with that. I would give up my rights. So I think that it is an interesting topic. I don't think that there is any control that you can have. You can only do the best things that you can possibly do. I think that intent of the author matters far more than the impact, because you cannot guess what the impact of your book is going to be, or your stories are going to be, or your life is going to be. And if you did everything based on an assumed impact of harm of you sharing parts of your life, then you're not going to do anything. But I also think it's interesting, and maybe there are studies of this, and so I'm just hyper focusing on this because this is the one that I found, but that we'll talk about the impact of triggering adults. But there's not as much discussion of the impact of exposing kids to content that prepares them for grooming. Like, obviously, I talk about that on this channel because of the ALA books. And what do you do when kids grow up around adult content and don't develop boundaries. And so then they become 22-year-olds and 23-year-olds and 27-year-olds and 32-year-olds that are then talking to 13-year-olds the same way that they were talked to as 13-year-olds. And then they are the ones called groomers because they are grooming kids, because they were groomed as kids and they don't recognize what they're doing is grooming. How do we talk about this impact? Can we talk about this impact? How do we talk about any of it? Because really it then comes down to calling people names and not actually discussing the issues. But I digress. Impact versus intent. And when does intent matter? So let me know where your thoughts lie with intent versus impact, responsibilities as a reader, responsibilities as an author, lying about marketing in general and surprising people, the differences between having twists in your story versus specifically trying to expose people to things in stories that you know is going to be extreme, or grooming. So let me know what your thoughts are on any of this going on. I think it is interesting. I don't think that there is anything really actionable here. I think it's just something that we can only share perspectives on because there are too many people in this world and with too many different perspectives on how to do things. But I think that discussing what we see and the reason behind choices as we see them or as we make them can help us better understand what other people are doing, or at least the world around us. Those are my thoughts. Looking forward to yours down in the comments below. With that said, have a great weekend and don't die.
Was that Wayland Cross in the trunk? Do you know, or is that something that's still being figured out?
The person in the trunk was not Wayland Cross. Is he in trouble? We don't know who did it, but as the owner of the car, the longer he's missing, the worse it looks for him.
Cross isn't a killer. For the last couple of years, the average number of murders in Baltimore has been over 300, and it's been going up. Mind you, that's only whatever the badges count as official murder, and believe me, there are people that don't count when they die. Wayland? If you're down here, tell me. I'm not talking to the badges, I've been looking for you. They found a body in your trunk. Way. Why? Did you do that? To the left. Plain black letters read along the wall. You walked in the corridor. Once that ends, you chose the dark is on the right. My vision goes blurry, flickers black and black and black for longer intervals until I can't see anything at all. I'm not screaming anymore, but my voice echoes back to me. Where the hell am I? You're dead, Josephine. Even smart people do stupid shit sometimes, right?